Hello, my friends, and welcome back again. In the last session, we looked at the causes of the French Revolution. Hopefully, you've been comparing them to the ideas of the Enlightenment, sort of measured them against classical liberalism and how well they held up to that. Today, we're going to look at the French Revolution itself. So it's Vive la Révolution, the French Revolution. Now, we've got a lot to cover here in this time frame. I'm not going to go through all the essential questions, but again, think of the big picture. As we look at the French Revolution, how well does it hold up to the ideas of the Enlightenment and classical liberalism? How well do they uphold those philosophies for which this thing really was originally started? Okay, so as we go through the entirety of the French Revolution, make sure you're thinking about that. How well does this align with the philosophies of the Enlightenment and classical liberalism? So without further ado, let's get started. We pick up right after the attack on the Bastille. Okay, the attack on the Bastille sets off waves of violence across the rural French countryside. Peasants and other commoners in the rural areas hearing and believing this rumor that the nobles are going to start hiring mercenaries and thugs to go attack them do what I suppose seemed like a good idea at the time, and that's start attacking nobles. Peasants and commoners in the countryside began attacking, assaulting nobles, beating, burning their homes, and even killing some. This incredible wave of violence was called the Great Fear, and it is like shock waves emanating out from Paris into the countryside, and this literally does shock people in Paris, the kind of violence that they're seeing out in the countryside. And so to try to end the violence, the National Assembly, which by now has become pretty much a de facto legislature in France, enacted reforms to the French societal and government system. They ended the old order of estates. They abolished the unfair tax system, very quickly making leaps forward and ending centuries of social iniquity and inequality. But they're not done yet. Next, the Assembly drafts and passes a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Now, it's supposed to be like a constitution, and it's inspired by Enlightenment ideas. It's filled with Enlightenment ideas like equality before the law, natural rights, things like that. And it's supposed to be a lot like our U.S. Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. In a lot of ways, the French Revolution is inspired by what happened in the American colonies, that they see the American colonies breaking away from Britain and establishing a new government, a republic, and they think they can do the same. And so the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is supposed to be something right along those lines. You have all this hope, all this optimism, so much change in such a short period of time, and the king is going to go ahead and put a kibosh on that. The king refuses to accept the declaration because he's afraid that it puts too many limits on his power. So we go from this time of great hope and jubilation to now people feeling fear and anxiety, once again thinking that the king might act militarily against the National Assembly. Well, things are going to stay quiet for just a little while until the fall of 1789. In the fall of 1789, we're going to see the revolution take another turn. And it all starts with a bad harvest that year. The bad harvest led to food shortages, in particular bread shortages. And, this is going to make people pretty angry. Think back to the old Snickers commercials, "You're not you when you're hungry." Well, the food shortages make people really, really angry. Hungry people kind of do that. And so rumors begin that the king and queen have bread and they're hoarding it at Versailles so that they can starve the people out. And with that, knowledge, sort of, in October, an angry mob of thousands of peasants and commoners marches to Versailles, ostensibly to get this bread from the king. But then once they get there, their motives sort of morph and become less food and more political, and they're calling for the king to step down or the king to come back to Paris with them. And as they rush the gates of Versailles, trying to get into and literally attack the palace, when the guards can no longer hold them back at the last minute, the king steps out on the balcony and says, "Okay, I will come back with you to Paris." And with that, the king gets an escort from an angry mob back to the city of Paris. And yes, Louis, you are correct. This is not going to end well. With now the king and the National Assembly both in Paris, they sit down and work on drafting a constitution. And they spend the better part of a year working on this. And you had the liberals on the left. These guys wanted a complete republic, wanted to get rid of the monarchy entirely. The conservatives on the right wanted to maintain the monarchy, maintain the status quo. Ultimately, they met somewhere in the middle, the moderate approach. And in 1791, a constitution that created a limited monarchy was presented. The king would remain in power, albeit on a limited status, and there would be a unicameral legislature, a one-house legislature, whose members would be elected by people who owned land. So you would have the right to vote, you would have an elected legislature, you'd have a limited monarchy, but go back to what I said about who would vote. The only people who could vote would be land-owning men. Think about that. Who are the people who own land? The nobles and the wealthy bourgeoisie. So who are the only ones that are voting? The nobles and the wealthy bourgeoisie. So you're still leaving out the vast majority of the French population. And even though this is a huge step forward, this constitution is doomed to fail because people didn't want a limited monarchy. What people wanted was a republic like the United States, and they just did not get what they wanted. Now, meanwhile, as all this is going on, the other monarchies in Europe are looking upon the situation in France with growing concern and growing fear. They see France and its revolution as like a fire. You think your neighbor's house is on fire. What are you afraid of? Well, the sparks could spread to your house and set your house on fire. And that's what the other monarchies in Europe see. They see the potential that the revolution in France could spread to their countries. And that is a real, legitimate fear. Well, the leaders of the French Revolution believe that those monarchies in Europe, countries like Austria, that they're going to act against France to try to stomp out the revolution, that they're going to act against France to put Louis back in power. So, of course, the leadership of the French Revolution does what is clearly the most logical and reasonable thing. They preemptively declare war against Austria because it makes perfect sense that when you are filled with a time of political instability and unrest in your own country, making war against someone else is a really good idea. I'm, of course, being sarcastic. The chaos of the revolution, coupled with this new threat of war, is about to make the situation much worse and much, much more violent. And as evidence of that fact, even Louis recognizes it. And in the summer of 1791, Louis tries to get his family an escape from France. They wanted to go to Austria, where his wife, Marie Antoinette, her brother was the emperor of Austria. And so they wanted to escape to Austria. But when you're the king, everybody recognizes you. Even though they disguise themselves as a bourgeoisie family, the king was easily recognized by some bystanders. The army was called in, and the whole family was arrested and brought back to Paris as prisoners. The situation is going to get much worse than that, though. Fast forward by about a year. It's nearly the fall of 1792. The war against Austria is going very, very poorly for the French. Fear permeates the streets, and sort of as the culmination of that fear and that anger, it gets directed towards the monarchy. In August of 1792, an angry mob, along with a whole bunch of French National Guardsmen, turn on the king and attack the royal palace in Paris, killing nearly all of the king's guards. The king and his family are forced to flee for their lives, and where do they go to seek refuge? They go to the legislature, the National Assembly, who quickly votes, rather than to help them, votes to imprison them, arrest them, and imprison them. So a lot of help he got out of that. The monarchy is effectively overthrown now at this point, but it's going to get worse. The next month, September of 1792, the fear of an imminent invasion by Austria is making people go just bananas. This crazy rumor starts spreading that a bunch of nobles and priests who are locked up in prisons are going to collude with the invading Austrians. And when the Austrians invade, supposedly these nobles and priests are going to bust out of prison and just start massacring everyone. So to prevent the massacre from the, somehow threatening people in prison, angry mobs go to the prisons and just start murdering and slaughtering and massacring the nobles and priests that are in these prisons. The bloodshed and the violence of the French Revolution is just unbelievable at this point. It's getting completely out of control, and we're not even to the worst part yet. So the king is effectively removed from power. That constitution in 1791 is annulled, and another new constitution is written. We're on constitution number 3 now. Good job, France. You really got this figured out. So in 1792, a new constitution is put together that completely disbands the monarchy and creates a republic. And this is what the majority of people had wanted anyway. The new government was made up of a unicameral, one-house legislature, and its members would be elected by those who could vote. And who could vote now? Any man, regardless of whether or not he owned land. Still not women, but any man, regardless of whether or not he owned land, could vote for that legislature. And with the new government in place, before they can move forward, they have to decide what they're going to do with the now former king. Louis, who has already been arrested and is imprisoned, is charged with the crime of conspiring against the liberty of the nation. Yeah, I've never heard of that crime either, but that's what they charged him with. And really, it's a foregone conclusion. You know where this is going. They're just looking to get rid of him. And indeed, they do. Of course, he's found guilty of conspiring against the liberty of the nation, and he is sentenced to be executed. And his execution is carried out on a cold January morning in 1793 on the machine that would really become the symbol of the French Revolution, the guillotine. And so the violence and the brutality and the bloodshed continues. After the death of Louis, a political faction called the Jacobins gained control over the French legislature. The Jacobins are extreme radicals who espouse persecution of the nobility and the bourgeoisie, and they want to continue and even spread the revolution. Now think about that. Hasn't the revolution accomplished pretty much everything it wanted to do? The king's gone, they're a republic now, but these guys want to continue the revolution and actively attempt to spread it to other countries. The leaders of the Jacobins are the people that you see in front of you there on the screen. Maximilien Robespierre is kind of the top dog, and his two top lieutenants are Georges-Jacques Danton and Jean-Paul Marat. And these guys are real firebrands, constantly preaching about, persecuting the aforementioned groups of people there. And once in power, they put this into practice, and they began a widespread persecution of all of their political opponents. People who hold different viewpoints from them, people who spoke out against them are being rounded up en masse, arrested, imprisoned, and some even executed. Well, in response to this, a supporter of the opposition party, a party called the Girondists, a supporter of the Girondists, a woman by the name of Charlotte Corday, murders Jean-Paul Marat. She manages to gain access to his house by claiming she has a list of names of people who are traitors, and she finds him in his bathroom sitting in that weird shoe-shaped bathtub there soaking, and she walks up and stabs him to death right there in his house. And then she doesn't even try to get away. She lets herself get arrested. Of course, she is put on trial and found guilty and guillotined, executed, along with any other Girondist who could be implicated in the plot to murder Marat. Again, this thing is just going completely haywire, out of control in France. Oh, and by now, France's war with Austria has blossomed into a much bigger conflict. France is no longer just at war with Austria, but they're at war with Prussia, Spain, the Netherlands, England, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. And this is not what a lot of French people signed up for. Obviously, they're not really happy with this development, and many people began to call for the removal of Robespierre, the removal of the Jacobins, and some people even support returning back to the monarchy. They said, heck, it wasn't even this bad when the king was in power. So you can see just how out of control things are getting. Well, in order to maintain their hold on power and to try to wipe out any more opposition to the revolution, Robespierre and the Jacobins began arresting and executing anyone who they brand as a, quote, traitor to the revolution. A traitor, of course, is anyone who opposes Robespierre and the Jacobins. And over the course of 1 year, from July 1793 to July 1794, roughly 40,000 people are arrested and executed at the guillotine as traitors to the revolution. This very ugly, brutal time period is known as the Reign of Terror. And that's not just some made-up name. That's what the Jacobins called it. The Terror. That's what they wanted it to be. Terrorize the enemy of the revolution, or enemies of the revolution. Well, by 1794, Danton starts to argue in favor of ending the terror. The war is turned in favor of the French, and he thinks it's not necessary to start killing anyone who disagrees with you anymore. Well, when he makes this suggestion, Robespierre accuses him of being a traitor, which leads to Danton and all of his supporters being arrested and executed on the guillotine. You can kind of see where this is really going, because Robespierre has now become a virtual dictator, which then leads the legislature to turn against him. He is himself charged as a traitor, arrested, and executed on the guillotine the next day. This is just falling apart at the seams. I told you this was going to be a big old pot of crazy, and I wasn't kidding. The death of Robespierre at least brings the Reign of Terror to an end. There's something to be had out of this. After the terror is over, a new government known as the Directory takes control in France. The Directory was ruled by a council of 5 men known as directors, and from 1795 to 1799, the government ruled by the Directory was inept, corrupt, and increasingly unpopular. Really, by now, the only thing that's going well for France is its wars. And so people start to look to their military heroes, their great generals, to liberate them from the Directory. And finally, that happens in 1799. A popular young military general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte returns to Paris from his campaigns in Egypt and overthrows the Directory in a coup d'etat. What a hero to France he must be, restoring the Republic and all. Oh, what's that? While pretending to lead a republic, he's really setting himself up as a military dictator? I totally didn't see that one coming. That's where we're going to leave the French Revolution for now, but man, that was crazy and a lot of stuff, but we did it. Think, especially, despite all those essential questions, about how all of this aligns with the ideas of the Enlightenment. Think about how all of this lines up with classical liberalism and the Enlightenment, and be ready to talk about that stuff the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.